Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am Roger Launius. Can everyone hear me okay? If I'm over here, can everybody hear me? Okay, because I wonder a little bit, so if you don't hear me, let me know. I am at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., where I am Associate Director for Collections and Curatorial Affairs. How many of you have been to my museum? Most of you. And for those of you who have not, I would welcome you at any point in time. And for those of you who have been previously but have not been recently, I would urge you to come back. We have just opened a brand new exhibition, our central hall called Milestones of Flight, where you can see the Spirit of St. Louis that Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic in 1927. The Bell X-1 that Chuck Yeager flew faster than the speed of sound for the first time in 1947, and a whole range of other very important things, including John Glenn's space capsule, and I might add a little thing that landed on the moon called the lunar module. All of those are in a brand new revamped Milestones of Flight hall. Please come and take a look. It is great. What I want to talk to you today about is going to the moon in the 1960s, how it relates to larger questions of transforming America and transforming the American South. And we'll walk through this, hopefully rather smartly. And as we do so, I will start with the prime text associated with this particular activity. It is,
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
okay. John F. Kennedy, May 25th of 1961, announced the decision to go to the moon, to do it by the end of the decade of the 1960s. That end of the decade, there's a little bit of wiggle room. Is it 1969 or is it 1970? Depends on when you start counting. When did the new millennium start? Was it 1999 or was it 2000? Or was it something else? We could play that game all day, but it gave a little bit of wiggle room to NASA in terms of achieving the objective of getting to the moon. They made it, of course, on the 20th of July in 1969. Everybody in this room does agree that that happened, right? If you do not, it will be a much longer presentation. We did indeed land on the moon. We did it 6 times. Kennedy's announcement of going to the moon was important in a whole lot of ways. It was fundamentally about beating the Soviet Union in an engagement that was in which 2 competing political and economic and military systems were at each other's throats, and it was a fight to the death. In this particular piece of the competition, no one would die, at least not intentionally. But clearly we would demonstrate the technological and scientific capabilities that would make us the world leader. As much as anything, Apollo was about impressing the rest of the world that we could achieve something that was unmatched in human history. And for those who were in emerging nations in other parts of the world, as many nations in the aftermath of World War II were born, they're looking to these 2 superpowers and they're thinking, which side should I fall in line with? They might have naturally been persuaded toward one or the other, but clearly this race, this demonstration of technological prowess would help to decide that particular thing. And the U.S. achieved exactly what they sought to achieve with the moon landings in the 1960s. So that Cold War origins of the Apollo program is what fueled the effort as we moved forward. And there were a whole series of objectives that were really critical. Most importantly, land on the moon. Demonstrate that we could do this. When you see the pictures of the astronauts on the lunar surface, you'll almost always see an American flag in it. Guess why? Because we're about proving that we can do this thing. Demonstrates American prowess vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. You know, NASA proposed the possibility of planting the UN flag on the moon in 1969. Guess how far that got? Literally, Congress passed a law that said the only flag that's going to be planted on the moon is the U.S. flag. And there's one reason why, to beat the Russians. There was an enormous technological advance through this process, and there was a scientific serendipity that resulted from it that nobody envisioned at the time, but was very real. Well, the Apollo program was a significant investment, $25.4 billion up until the time of the first lunar landing in 1969. Multiply that by close to 10 if you want to get today's dollars, and that's not an insignificant sum of money. It would have, I would suggest to you, at 10 times that price, been a bargain for what they essentially achieved. 6 successful moon landings, 3 circumlunar flights. Apollo 8 and Apollo 10 were planned. Apollo 13 was a circumlunar flight, and has everybody seen the movie with Jim Lovell? So you know what happened. There was an accident on the way to the moon. They could not land, but they brought him home alive. Apollo 13 did not land, but did a circumlunar flight. Technological advance was stunning in a whole lot of ways. We can talk more about that another time if you wish. The scientific vision was great. But it was expensive. This is the NASA budget as a percentage of the federal budget. What you could see in 1958 when the agency is born is a very tiny amount of money, less than 1/4% of the federal budget. As you can see, early on, very small budget, but it skyrockets. 1961 is the announcement of the Apollo decision. The NASA budget goes up and then peaks in 1965 to almost 4.5% of the federal budget. That is a significant investment, and that's the investment that took us to the moon. As soon as they start the run-out costs associated with Apollo, these are the startup costs fundamentally. It starts to go back down. It bottoms out in the 1970s, around 73, 74 timeframe, and it stayed below 1% since that time. You can see way over here on the far right-hand side, it's a little bit less than 0.5% of the federal budget today. And that's what most people think is appropriate for the NASA program. But that's not what we'll be able to do in terms of going to the moon. And I would suggest to you, just as a side, if NASA wants to go to Mars or back to the moon or any other location, if it can figure out a way to do it within the profile that you see over on that far right-hand side, everyone will cheer. If it's going to take those kinds of dollars, it's not happening, period. Okay, that is the investment that took us there. That was the result of the Cold War objective. There was a secondary objective that became ultimately maybe more significant as the Apollo program began to unfold. With the assassination of John Kennedy in 1963, the ascension of Lyndon Johnson to the presidency at the same time, and the development of new agenda initiatives associated with that presidency, some of which were already underway beforehand, but that Great Society effort beginning in the mid-1960s was a piece of this as well. The speech that is quoted here is at the University of Michigan in 1964, and LBJ says, "For better or for worse, your generation has been appointed to by history, to lead America toward a new age. Will you join us in the battle to build the Great Society? To prove that our material progress is only the foundation on which we will build a richer life of mind and spirit." Okay, so what does that mean for NASA? Well, immediately James Webb, the NASA administrator, who was an old New Deal Democrat who had come to town in the 1930s from North Carolina to work initially in Congress as a staffer and later on as a Washington insider lawyer type, and ultimately in the Truman administration as both director of the Bureau of the Budget and undersecretary for state. Webb comes back in 1961 to the new Kennedy administration and takes over NASA. And he was brilliant at trying to match the objectives of the space agency with the larger political agenda that he saw around him. Cold War was a piece of that, but as soon as he saw the potential of the Great Society, he began to talk about this in the context of what was the Apollo program in that context. As he said to Webb, Webb wrote a memo to LBJ in which he said, "I know of no area where the inspirational thrust toward doing everything required of a great society can be better provided. on a proven base of competence and with so many practical additional benefits to be derived than through the space program. The space program lies in your first area of building that great society, for it is truly an imaginative new program based on new ideas and new capabilities. So he made the case very early on. Johnson accepted that. And throughout the rest of his presidency talked about it, and in his memoirs talked about it. Space was the platform from which the social revolution of the 1960s was launched. We broke out of far more than the atmosphere with our space program. If we could send a man to the moon, we knew we should be able to send a poor boy to school and to provide decent medical care for the aged. In hundreds of other forms, the space program had an impact on our lives. Now that's his assessment. What does that mean for the American South? If it is a part of the Great Society, and there is quote after quote after quote after quote that I could give you about that context, what does it mean for the South? Well, it's actually pretty interesting. If you look at these NASA facilities in 1970, what you will see is that the majority of them are in the American South. There's some in California, and there's a couple up in Ohio area, in Cleveland, and there's one in New England that got closed down in 1970, I might add. But all the rest are in the American South, especially the southern states that seceded from the Union. You see some in Maryland, but in Virginia, the Langley Research Center, obviously Kennedy Space Center, which we're all familiar with here for Alabama, the Marshall Space Flight Center, but the National Test Space Technologies Laboratories, now Stennis Space Center in Mississippi, 2 facilities in Alabama, or in Louisiana, the Manned Spacecraft Center, now Johnson Space Center in Houston, and so forth. All created in the American South, all with the specific task of helping us reach the moon, but more important than that, for the local region, how does it change the nature of this particular region? Government investment, the movement into areas of people with advanced college and in some cases graduate degrees, changing the nature of the area in which they live. In terms of NASA center personnel, you can see that in 1961 there's less than 10,000 that are in the American South at the 4 major centers that are located there, but it grows, it doubles by the middle part of the decade, and it stays around that and right up to the present. It's greater than that today. If you look at NASA spending, now this is from 1998, but it's not much different than earlier areas. Look at the money that's being invested in contracts in the American Southwest and the Southeast. Look what's being invested in the Great Plains, in the Rocky Mountains. There's a fair amount in the far west, a little bit in the mid-Atlantic, nothing almost in New England. The fundamental advance of the technology development that results from those kinds of investments in the American South are very real. And it probably transformed the South in pretty fundamental ways. The question is in what ways and how do we try to understand that. So I love this picture. It's sort of the old South and the new South on the left-hand side. That's a test stand at what is now the Stennis Space Center in Mississippi. And they decided to pull the mule out and hook up a plow to it just to show you the difference between the old and the new. More importantly was the development and the building of the Saturn V rocket, the most powerful rocket ever developed, one that delivered 7.5 million pounds of thrust at launch in its first stage, the one that took the astronauts to the moon in the 1960s and 70s. The development of that project was at Huntsville at the Marshall Space Flight Center. They had contracts literally all over the South. And the way in which they moved these rocket stages as they developed them was through the waterway system of the Tennessee River, the Mississippi River. And you can see Huntsville moving up the Tennessee, down the Mississippi, stopping at various places along the way, going to the Mississippi Test Facility, and then ultimately to the Kennedy Space Center, where they were launched to take us to the moon. The American South is central to this particular activity. It could have been done in different ways, But as it was, it made a transforming and a transformative approach to the American South. African American engineers and scientists found their ways into NASA during the same time frame. There are a few examples of this that are pretty fundamental. The picture on the left is obviously a staged photograph. And you see an African American standing on a ladder preparing a wind tunnel model of the Saturn 1B rocket for a wind tunnel test at the Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia. That's 1965. How many engineers do you know wear a coat and tie to work? And so there's definitely a stage photo. I would love to find this individual, but I have not had any success doing so. On the right, you see two scientists. The one on the far right is George Carruthers at the Naval Research Lab, which is in suburban Maryland, building the Apollo 16 lunar surface ultraviolet camera. It's a telescope, really. George is still on the staff 50 years after the fact at the Naval Research Lab doing his thing. And he looks a little older now, but nonetheless, he's still operating there. And he flew, as a scientist, this particular experiment on the Apollo 16 mission. It had a significant impact in terms of what we understand about the Earth-Sun relationship. And that's just one example among several. There's another one that has been developed and understood more fully in the last few years, and that's a small group of African-American engineers who come out of the American South, who found their way to Marshall Space Flight Center, in a few cases to the Kennedy Space Center, and into a larger number into Houston to what was the Manned Spacecraft Center, now the Johnson Space Center. Pictured here is Clyde Foster, and this is a photograph from 1965 that appeared in Ebony magazine. As he is working in the computer facility at the Marshall Space Flight Center, crunching numbers, who knows exactly for what, but associated with Apollo. He and a number of others have recently had their story sort of rescued from history. And there was a book by a couple of historians last year from the University of Texas Press that tell the story of these young African-American engineers coming out of Southern University in Baton Rouge and moving to the Marshall Space Flight Center to become a part of the space program. There's a new book that's just coming out and a movie that is just now coming out about African-American women in the space program, all of whom were at the Langley Research Center during the 1960s, and they were what they called computers. Does anybody know that term from engineering? Other than the digital things that we're familiar with, like we've got on our desks. The number crunchers, the individuals, before we had digital or even analog computers, there were individuals who did the calculations. They used calculating machines of various types, and they would analyze the data collected by engineers and put it into tables and charts that could then be used for future research purposes. Most of the people who did that work throughout the 20th century, in the United States anyway, were women. They were typically math majors who came out of college, and this was one of the career fields that was open to them pretty readily. And so we find this taking place early on in the early programs for aerospace research, or actually aeronautics research in the first part of the 20th century, with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which was NASA's predecessor organization. And they hired these women to engage in this particular type of activity, calculating all of this. And if you ever look at NASA or the NACA research reports, you will see table after table after table of statistical information that was compiled by these computers. In the 1940s, for the first time during World War II, the Langley Research Center hired African-American women to be a part of that computing program. They were so strapped for resources in terms of finding talented people that they scoured the place looking for individuals who could do this type of work. They hired lots of white women as well, but African-American women were hired and put in segregated facilities at the Langley Research Center to engage in this particular work. Some of them continued through into the 1970s. In fact, indeed, after that time as well. And there's a new movie coming out that you may want to see that talks about some of these African-American women's experiences with NASA in the 1960s as they engaged in this work of calculating trajectories and stresses and aerodynamics and so forth in the context of the space program. Okay. There's a dominant narrative about Apollo that we've all heard many, many times. And it has fundamentally to do with the fact that the United States is an exceptional nation. American exceptionalism is a term that the folks associated with the space program have never been hesitant to use. And maybe rightly so, but nonetheless, whether you want to criticize that or not criticize it, it is a term that has been used. The story is that we were initially shocked by the success of the Soviet Union. Then we put our shoulder to the grindstone, our head to the wheel, or whatever we choose, whatever metaphor we choose, and then we set a goal and we achieved that goal, and aren't we great? It's a classic story of American progress. It comforts the public. It especially comforts the ruling class in our society, and the moon landings are the epitome of this triumph. And how many times have you heard said, especially those of you who are a little older, if we can put a man on the moon, why can't we name the hard thing of your choice? At some level, that's true. Although I would suggest to you that solving a technical problem is a whole lot easier than solving a lot of social problems. It suggests, however, that Apollo has this very positive perspective that is one that's looked back on with rose-colored glasses. Is there anybody in this room who thought Apollo was a bad idea? Don't have to raise your hand. I can tell you at the time there were a lot of people who thought it was a bad idea. They thought it cost too much money, that it was a waste of resources, and that included people who were both on the political left and the political right, referred to as a moondoggle, for instance. Suggested that it wasn't something that should be done in the context of a national program because it didn't really serve to benefit the American public as a whole, never mind the larger geopolitical issues that it did work to resolve. And as a result of that, it probably shouldn't have been done. But the dominant narrative is still present, that it was a great success and that we all should be very proud of that. Is there anybody who was alive in 1969 who does not know where they were when they heard about the moon landings or saw Neil Armstrong walk on the moon? It's one of those events by which you mark the time of your lives. Most of those events that we mark are bad things. They're horrible things like 9/11. In this particular case, a very positive one. But that does not mean that it's not criticized in pretty fundamental ways, even right up to today, and mostly in the context of the larger issues associated with criticisms of the Great Society. So, Wally McDoogle, Walter A. McDoogle, professor at the University of Pennsylvania today, wrote the only book ever published about the space program that won the Pulitzer Prize. It's called The Heavens and the Earth. It's a political history of the space age, published in 1985, right in the midst of the Reagan presidency. He criticizes all of NASA and all of the space race and all of the space program in the context of the American right. And he emphasized that the hero of the story was a person like Eisenhower, who tried to put the brakes on all the things associated with NASA and the space program. And the villains of the story were Kennedy and especially Lyndon Johnson. because of the association of spending all of these dollars in sort of a fruitless task, he viewed this as a part of a larger set of initiatives that were great society initiatives aimed at Medicare, expansion of all kinds of social services, and so forth. And Apollo was, in his words, in the quote at the bottom, a product of the maniacal 1960s. Well, what does that really mean? That's a good question, one I don't have an answer for, except to say that I would suggest to you that Apollo was a great society program. It began as a Cold War initiative and transformed itself. It still achieved that larger Cold War objective for which it was established. But by the 1963 timeframe, Kennedy was walking away from it, pretty fundamentally. There are now transcripts of conversations inside the Oval Office in the latter part of the Kennedy administration before his assassination, in which he's talking about, I don't think I can sustain this. This is not going to cut it. There's too much criticism from, in his particular case, the Republicans, who thought that this was a waste of energy and a waste of money. And fundamentally, it's about beating the Russians, and if we're already on the road to beating the Russians, why do we need to carry on with this? In the fall, early September of 1962, he called James Webb into the Oval Office for a meeting. And in that particular meeting, Webb was told by Kennedy, I'm going to go to the UN and I'm going to propose that we turn Apollo into a joint program. Can you imagine what might have happened then? And he did, indeed he did that. On the 20th of September of 1963, he gave a UN speech in which he proposed that, that they do this together, that the Soviets and the Americans go to the moon together. Sergei Khrushchev, the son of Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, was an engineer working in the Soviet space program at the time. And by the way, Sergei's still alive. He is at Brown University. He is a U.S. citizen now, and I'm sure his father is spinning in his grave at that particular turn of events. But Sergei will tell you the story how after Kennedy gave that speech to the UN, he got a call from his father and told him to, and he asked him to come to the Kremlin. And Sergei went to the Kremlin and he said, what do you think about this thing that Kennedy's suggesting, that we do this together? And Sergei Khrushchev's response was, well, that might be a good idea. There is the potential that we can reduce our costs of the space program for the Soviets, which was quite high. And of course, they had less margin to play with than we did in terms of resources. And it also sends the signal to the rest of the world that the Americans and the Russian programs are on a par with each other, and therefore can be looked at as co-equal. So it could be a positive for us. And the premier acknowledges that that might be the way to go. And a couple of months later, Kennedy is assassinated. A little while after that, Khrushchev is deposed and nothing changes. And we carry on with our moon landing by the end of the decade. It's a fascinating question. No one can ever know the answer. We played these games repeatedly. We have a sort of a strange term for them in history, counterfactuals, but it's basically what ifs. You know, what if this had happened or that had not happened? And in this particular case, what if Kennedy had not been assassinated? He served his first term. He probably would have won re-election. And what might have taken place in that context? No one can ever know the answer, but the trajectory that we were on in the context of Apollo in that 1963 timeframe could suggest that it might be time to kind of pare it back a little bit. It would have been a very easy decision in 64, 65, especially 66. After the Gemini program had become very successful and the two astronaut missions had been carried off so well that they might have announced that, you know, we don't have to reach the moon by the end of the decade. We can do it on a schedule that's a little more leisurely. They could have turned off the clock. What might that have meant? You could have saved a little money, but more important than that, Apollo would have looked maybe more like some of the other programs that NASA's engaged in since that time, without that clock. It's a great what if. No one can ever know the answer. You can play with it till the cows come home. As it was, we did go, and we succeeded by the end of the decade. But what does that mean in terms of the American South, in terms of where the money was being spent? Huge amounts of money being spent in the American South. What did it do to change Southern economics? Certainly, Huntsville changed and was transformed fundamentally. Certainly, the area around the Kennedy Space Center, Merritt Island, was transformed fundamentally. Maybe less so in Houston, since it was already a large city with a major technological capability. But some of these other places were also fundamentally transformed. Southern Mississippi, where the Stennis Space Center is located, clearly is also in the same category. There are a variety of conclusions that one might be able to reach about this, but I would love to be able to focus at some point in time in a more systematic and effective way to look at the role that these particular investments, the movement of people into these particular regions with the skill sets that they brought and the background and the culture that they brought with them, how did that change the American South? And how might we start to look at the Apollo program, which has not really been viewed as a part of the Great Society at all, but probably is, and maybe should be thought of in that particular way, at least from the time that Johnson announces those efforts until his departure at the end of his term in January of 1969. So, how might this change affect our perceptions of Apollo? We'll never know the answer. With that, I will end and be glad to take any questions on any subject you can think of. This one, baseball. I do Mormon studies. Whatever. Thank you very much.
I got here late, but I enjoyed what I heard.
Thank you.
And especially the part, how did it change the South?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a graduate of Tuskegee Institute.
Okay.
And I remember many of our engineer student grads went to Huntsville to work in the Redstone.
Right.
And so it changed for black folks skill sets and integrated the South in that area.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. Dan?
I've got a question about Verner von Braun. I know during the 60s...
You notice I did not mention him once.
During the 60s, I know he was a big hero. How do you think the perceptions of him have changed since the 1960s?
Well, I mean, everybody knows who Verner von Braun was, right? And maybe younger folks don't remember him. Those of us who are a little older probably grew up on him, watching him on television on the Disney series or whatever else. And he became a major spokesperson for human spaceflight and for going to, especially ultimately to Mars. And he always would wave his arms and talk about how easy all this was going to be. By the way, was he totally wrong about that? But he was sort of a public face of space and science at some level. And we periodically, you know, we have these individuals that emerge that kind of have a public persona in this area. My favorite example, who literally, I came very close when I was a graduate student at LSU to changing my major to astrophysics after having seen the Cosmos series with Carl Sagan. Never mind the fact I never could handle math, but that's why I'm a historian. But he was sort of in that category in the 50s and at some level in the 1960s. In fact, he made NASA crazy because he would go off and do this public speaking sort of stuff and go off the reservation all the time. And they had to keep reeling him back in because by the time the Apollo program was underway, they have a very set standard of things that they want people to say in a public setting, and von Braun never did that. Now, I think probably what you're talking about is those who know him at all now, and it wasn't very common knowledge at the time in the 50s and the 60s, he came out of Nazi Germany. He was indeed a member of the Nazi Party. He was a major in the SS. All that's true. He did not talk to many people about that. He wouldn't, if you confronted him, it wouldn't lie to you, but nonetheless, that was a story that was pretty well hidden. What we have come to find out really since his death is how intertwined the German V2 program, which is a rocket, a ballistic missile program in World War II, with concentration camp labor and the horrible abuses associated with that. Some 10,000 or so people died in the concentration camp where they were building the V2s, which, by the way, it was more people than were killed by the V2s when they launched them at London and Antwerp and Paris and various other places. But that didn't come to light until after he died, and he died in 1977. There was a member of that German rocket team that came with von Braun to America that his name was Arthur Rudolph. He had operated the facility where they built the V2s, therefore he had direct under his control the concentration camp laborers who were worked to death there. He came to America. He was the Saturn V project manager, and he got away with that until 1980 when he gave up his U.S. citizenship, went back to Germany, or faced prosecution in the United States for war crimes. And that's probably what you're trying to get to. Most people didn't know about that at the time, and so it did not factor into how they interpreted Verner von Braun. Today, it's impossible to get past it. Everybody knows about it. And for those who wish to keep sort of what we might consider the positive side of Verner von Braun alive, this is a very, very dark story that sort of gets in the way of that. And so the people in Huntsville who revere von Braun to this day are troubled by this if they know about it at all. In some cases they don't. In other cases they deny that it actually happened, it's been made up by somebody else. And those that are looking at it rationally try to figure out ways to kind of live with these two sides of the story. Okay. I think that's probably enough on Verner von Braun.
With the very public emphasis on the space program in the past, how do you explain the de-emphasizing of the space program today?
Okay. Well, I mean, part of it is simply that NASA's efforts today are built around a budgetary profile that's much, much smaller than what we saw during the Apollo program of the 1960s. Consequently, it's going to be much less ambitious. It doesn't mean they don't have those ambitions, they just don't have the means to carry them out. But I would contend that NASA is still one of the top agencies in the federal government that has people following it on a regular basis, that it's also got these sort of general feel-good perspective about it. And that's not true for a lot of other federal agencies. There's no organized opposition to NASA anywhere in the United States. Certainly not true for the EPA, not true for the Department of Education, not true for the Department of Energy, not true for the IRS, and I could go on. But it is true for NASA. Mostly we sort of like what they do. But we don't like it well enough to put a lot of money into it. And that's where I get back to my point that I made earlier. If NASA can carry out its ambitious desires within a funding profile similar to what it's got today, I think we'll all cheer. It's not that we're opposed to it, but we're not willing to give it a lot more money.
But isn't it more privatized?
Well, no, actually it's not. That's a misnomer. And this is an example of journalists taking the easy road out in terms of explaining things. And we heard some of that this morning from Dan Carter, but it's sort of surface level things. And so we love to talk about the entrepreneurial spirit of an Elon Musk and SpaceX, or Jeff Bezos and Blue Horizons, or Sir Richard Branson and Virgin Galactic, all of which are companies that are building hardware and are engaging in activities that may lead us in a direction toward more aggressive space activities. It's possible. Not certain by any means. And that's fine. But all those companies are in it to make some money. And right now, the place that they're getting the money is the government. Either selling services to NASA or the Department of Defense, or hopefully someday to maybe tourists who would fly into space, but that's not real yet. And, but right now, they're basically government contractors, if they're doing much of anything. SpaceX, which loves to talk about how entrepreneurial it is and how different it is from all the things that have gone before, is simply a contractor, just like Boeing or Lockheed or Northrop Grumman or anybody else, to NASA, providing launch services to take cargo to the International Space Station. They are building a capsule that they hope will be able to take people to the International Space Station, although they're 2 or 3 years away from that at least. But they're contractors right now. But you wouldn't know that necessarily from reading most of the newspaper accounts or hearing it on television. Anybody else?
I can't let this opportunity pass without asserting that I'm probably the only journalist who ever interviewed Verner von Braun and Elvis Presley on the same day in Huntsville, Alabama.
All right.
But that's not my question. My question has to do with, go back to your map about the location and the spending of the money and so forth in the South. To what extent did all that, the location of these bases where they were, how much of that is geography? How much of it is Southern seniority, dominance in the legislative process? What's the explanation for that?
Well, some of both, obviously. But even some, you'll notice, for instance, well, it doesn't show on this. Let me go back one more. You'll notice on this that South Carolina doesn't have a NASA center. That was not because Mendel Rivers didn't try. He tried desperately to get a center there down in the Charleston district and couldn't do it. And in fact, one quip about this was he was trying to put so many federal agencies in the Charleston area that he was going to sink the whole area and put it underwater from the weight. But South Carolina was frozen out, North Carolina was frozen out, mostly because their political delegations didn't have the kind of support necessarily that other places did. The Florida Center, the Kennedy Space Center, that's a geographical feature of the fact that they wanted to launch as far to the south as they possibly could, and Miami was already taken. And it has to do with the equatorial orbit and flying to the east. So Kennedy made sense there. Houston was purely a political decision. There was no reason otherwise to put anything there except for the congressman who represented that district who insisted it be there. Johnson wanted a Texas center. There's no doubt about that. But where in Texas he didn't necessarily care. But the Manned Spacecraft Center, now the Johnson Space Center, was in Houston because of the congressional leadership there. Same is true for Mississippi and Louisiana and a variety of places like that. So it's mostly about politics, of course.
A related question. Did the Johnson or Kennedy administrations ever use NASA as a carrot to get their civil rights legislation passed?
Well, they used to beat up NASA about it. Yeah, there's a bit of that goes on. The details are a little bit open-ended. We don't really know a lot about this. One of the things that Jim Webb did as the NASA administrator was go to the center directors in the American South and say, look, you've got to hire African-American engineers. You've got to do that. And I wasn't going to bring him up again, but I will. Verner von Braun said, hey, I've been trying to, and nobody wants to come work here. I can't say as I blame them at the time. But they were able to persuade a few to come to work there over time. But the local cities, there was not much interaction there that I'm aware of in terms of making places better for African Americans to live if they came to work there for NASA. And NASA was not highly involved in a lot of this in most places. There were some community groups who got involved in some level, but at best they had moral suasion on their side. Anybody else? All right. Well, hey, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.